Let's talk about new ways to make old wine. So the picture on the left is actually a photo I snapped in Pompeii. So this is back, long time ago. And you can see that they were, using amphora back then for wine production. And then they had smaller ones to transport around and carry around the wine. So pretty fantastic. And then on the right, I provided a link in Canvas to this, but there was an article written by Paul Greggett about our amphora wine production that we've been doing for the last few years. And so I thought it was pretty interesting. And he gave some reviews on the wines as well. So why did this happen? Basically, it's all Philippe's fault. And I think that's the reason for it. So Philippe is a good friend of ours. He's been a friend of mine for the whole time I've been here. He used to sell barrels. And after he got done selling barrels, he moved on to selling some amphora, and he convinced me to buy one. So they cost about as much as a barrel, not a whole lot more. They were about $1,400. So we figured, what the heck, let's give it a shot. It was a good chance for you guys to get an earthenware experience, and I didn't have to buy a giant concrete fermenter, which we just really don't have room for. So really cool. We started in 2017. We had really, really good success, really well received by the public. So we thought, what the heck, let's repeat it in 2018. So we got to give a shout out to the people that did this. So here's some of the characters that were involved in this. So here we've got Megan Barlow, Ashley, Jasmine, and Emilio, who did the conventional Barbera. And again, Megan, had to do the Italian varieties. And Daniel and Carrie and Keith, who did the Barbera and conventional, and or the amphora. And then Megan Barlow, Daniel B, and Carrie and Lionel, who did the Sangio conventional and amphora. And also remember to point out that the Barbera that you guys have in front of you is from the amphora was done with Pied de Cuve. So we'll do that. Talk about that too as we go through. Okay, so the reality is, why the heck would you do this? What's the point? So our idea here was to try to make a wine that we could replace the SO2 on. And SO2 basically performs two functions in wine. Number one, it's an antioxidant. So who needs antioxidants when you've got the grapes involved? We've got lots of grapes around. They have lots of phenolics. They're really a huge oxygen sink. And then also we have yeast and microflora going on all the time that are things that consume oxygen. So we have, we have aerobic bacteria. They're happy to suck up that oxygen. So do we need to use really SO2 as long as we have some sort of conversion process going on and we have the grapes involved in the process? And the other thing is SO2 is a toxin. It kills off microbes, right? So the thing is do we really need an antimicrobial if we get the alcohol high enough? And I can't stand the food babe because she's one of those people that would say, you can't have SO2 in wine. But you know what? I think it's a better idea to talk about the purpose of alcohol. And not only does it kill microbes, but it'll certainly get a monk very drunk. And it's just important to have a drunk monk in any particular thing. So we'll just cover up the toxin idea. And we're just going to make our own toxin. And if we get the alcohol content high enough, we know once we get up above, 15% alcohol, Brettanomyces doesn't really like to live. And then we can put another hurdle in front of Brettanomyces by making a wine that's relatively low in pH. So these Roman varieties, Barbera and Sangio, are both notably high in acid, and their pHs tend to be fairly low in the grand scheme of things. So we've got a few things working for us. We've got good acidity, low pH. That's a more difficult environment for things to grow in. And then once we get the alcohol up high enough to knock a monk on his butt, we'll be able to have effective antimicrobial properties. So let's go through the juice chemistry in the Sangiovese. So the idea here is to shoot for a little over 15% alcohol. Our estimated TIA is going to around 6.7-ish would be my guess. By the time we take out some potassium, maybe knock that down to, some lower number, and then we convert that malic to about 0.8. So I would expect the tartaric to go down by about a gram a liter and some change, and then I would expect the malic acid to turn into about 0.8. So I would around 6.7, 6.8, 6.9 grams a liter, somewhere in that range once we get through conversion. And the pH is really nice and low. We're coming into ferment at a pH of 3.35. That selects microorganisms we want. Not much likes to grow there. It's pretty much Enococcus and yeast only. And the other thing is, notice how low that malic acid is. We got a lot of tartaric. We've talked about that. This isn't going to shift as much. It's not going to be as dramatic. But the thing that's really cool here is there's no yan, none. 23 milligrams a liter. That's none, like zero. That might as well be none. And according to literature, you're going to have horrible hydrogen sulfide problems. You'll have a stuck ferment. You have to have at least 100 parts per million, 100 milligrams a liter to ferment 12% alcohol according to literature. You can't do this. I don't get it. This doesn't make sense. I think part of the reason we do this is we get a long, slow, drawn out ferment because it's so long. We're not trying to run it through in 5, 6, 7 days. These ferments can take literally months, and I'll show you the Barbera graphs. They're really impressive. So when we've got this extended ferment time and we're fermenting super cold and we're using pre-adapted yeast, we're not pitching yeast. We're not starting yeast that are out of nowhere. They're already living in wine. And we start with a low enough population. My thoughts are, and these are just swags, this is just guesses. There's nothing more than that than just a guess. I think that as these fermentations go, and they go so slowly, that as generations of yeast die off, they actually break down, and the next generation of yeast kind of cannibalizes them and uses their nitrogen. And we do see nitrogen go back up in after ferment, especially with yeast stirring and things like that. We see yeast assimilable nitrogen come back into the wine, and that's because it's being released from the yeast. So I think we have some sort of a cannibalistic effect. But still fascinating that this went through completely clean, completely dry, with virtually no nitrogen. So interesting thing about the fermentation kinetics, primary ferment, we talked about it going a long time, was just at 100 days that we got dry. And then it took 225 days for malic to finish. And as soon as malic is done, we press these and bottle them because we know that there's no more CO2 liberation. There's nothing else going to be there to suck up oxygen. So the way that we're managing this is by doing such a long, slow, controlled ferment, and then also keeping those skins engaged. So we've got our antioxidant with the microbes, and then the yeast and the skins being combined. And then the other thing is that we have our antimicrobial alcohol contents high enough that we want to get that off skins and get it into bottle as quick as possible. Generally, we scorpion these, and if there was any bread or anything, we wouldn't bottle them, but they were pretty clean. So we'll talk about that. But the Barbera was a little different. It didn't ferment cleanly. It didn't ferment perfectly. The Sangiovese is a lesson in sheer luck. The Barbera was a little different. So let's talk about the juice chemistry in the Barbera. Look at the sugar in that. We've got 28 basically bricks, 280 grams a liter of sugar. It's 27.1 bricks, but when you actually look at the sugar, and then the yan again is really low in the grand scheme of things because of how far we're going to be fermenting this to. So we shot for 15% alcohol on the regular, but and I don't think we watered back the Amphora. I can't find any records on this. So the thing I would expect with this is that when this goes through malic, we're going to have a bigger shift because we're at pH 327, but look at all that malic we've got to get through. So we're going to have a bigger shift in this wine than we will the other ones in terms of probably a bit of pH, but mostly just the amount of acid that we're going to have drop out, because if not, we'd have a almost 10 gram a liter acid wine, and I think it's going to end up probably closer to that 6-ish range, 6 to 7-ish range. By the time we get through ferment, just looking at those numbers after we get through malolactic. And so this is what I found for the additions, and this is the fact that it was crash pitched from the red bucket, and then a third of the bucket, and then 2/3 went down the drain. We didn't pitch a whole lot because we didn't want a massive yeast population. So that's it. And the Sangiovese didn't look a whole lot different. It just said some EC118 yeast from something. So I'm assuming we had something else running, maybe Merlot. With EC118, and we cross-pitched it, and that's about what it said for the Sangiovese. So that's it. Those are the only additions. Kind of fun, very different from some of the other wines that we do at the school. And then I wanted to show you this. This is a scorpion and yeast DNA profile of the Pied de Cuve. So we sent these both in and noticed that they had 1.7 million cells in the blue bucket and 752,000 in the blue bucket. In the red bucket. So I think that's the difference, is the B and R if I look back on this. So we built our own yeast culture. So what we have here is a screenshot of the report I got from ETS. And if you take a look at it, we'll notice that we have both Barbera and buckets that we made for the Pied de Cuve. And they went through the whole process. You guys can look up the Pied de Cuve SOP if you want. But we noticed that in the one blue bucket, We had a little bit of EC118 around, and that's it. But when you see the amount on the screen, it's very small. Then we look at the red bucket, we had a few more yeast, but the only things are there's some different strains sharing a lot of stuff, but what we see in this one is nothing really matched any commercial strains. So what's really fascinating about these two, and you see these two graphs side by side, is they're totally different in their makeup. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And so here we go here, and we have two different buckets made on the same day by the same people, and look at the different results. This is how much more diversity we have. And it's just really interesting to see how crazy a ferment can be when you do these wild ones. And this is just a spectacularly cool thing, and maybe we'll talk about it at some point in time, but I just thought you guys get a kick out of that. And then we went ahead and moved on and ran another profile later on, after ferment was pretty well kind of moved through and done. But realize when you're doing a primary ferment with Pied de Couve, you don't know what else you got growing either. So one thing we were looking at is Saccharomyces, but who knows what else we had kind of growing along. But again, when we looked at this, again, we have a very different yeast cell population. But look, we do have a little bit of that EC118 showing up again. And here we are, but still a small amount. That's represented by E11, and it's just green. And there's just a little bit, but everything else is pretty diverse. And we have used EC118 in the Amphora before, so I'm assuming that's where this one sort of creeped in at. Pretty interesting. I'd love to have the Barbera group chime in the comment section and kind of let us know what they did when they pitched that Pied de Couve. All right. Good lesson, boys and girls. I love this. So we started running malic acids about 40 days after primary fermentation. And this is a fantastic graph because it took 415 days for this to go malic dry. So we pressed it after a little over a year on skins and right at a little before a year on skins. So right at 300 days, I think is when we pressed it because we had to start getting ready for the next harvest. And then it went into a stainless barrel where it kind of continued going. And we didn't know if we were ever going to actually bottle this. I almost wrote it off. And but we see how long the malic took. And there's some reasons for that, and especially when we see the alcohol content in the wine. So after 40 days of fermentation, we went ahead and started pulling some sugar samples. And sure enough, our sugar is going down very, very, very slowly. But our malic's also going down very, very slowly. So the question is, what's happening? And winemakers always say the same thing. You know, they're kind of the eternal optimists. In this case, we couldn't do anything because we wanted to keep the wine genuine. We wanted to keep it true. So we just kept measuring sugar and measuring malics. And the thing is the winemakers, that being that eternal optimist, they always come up to me and say, oh yeah, it's still fermenting. I can hear it popping, it's snapping and crackling. Something's doing it. Well, the question is, what's getting rid of the sugar at this point in time? And the fact of the matter is the yeast have pretty much given up the ghost. You know, we used a Pied de Couve, we used unknown yeast strains, we kept our fingers crossed, and yeah, but when you make a Pied de Couve, you don't just make yeast. Other things are going to start growing too. So there was a very active malolactic culture obviously going because the ML's going down. So what else was being produced? Yeah. And so you can see where the yeast gave up. After about 155 days, the yeast decided to phone it in. They were done. They were done making alcohol. It was at 15% alcohol. There was no more they could get out of it. And that's when the yeast gave up. And that's when the malolactic bacteria came along and looked for something else to eat. And you can see that they're the primary drivers of the sugar depletion at this point in time. And so we see our VA go up. And, you know, oh well. You know, I think the thing is that you got to live with it. It's a bummer deal, but if you're going to make a natural wine, you've just got to live with what's happening. So we stayed true to our roots and completed it. And, you know, I'd like to say that everyone watching agrees right now. It should be at least illegal in some extreme circumstances. So I think we have absolutely seen that, and at least it's still legal. And hey, maybe it's interesting. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the chemistry on these. So here's our alcohol contents. I thought this was pretty interesting. You've got basically identical alcohol contents on this Barberas, but a good contribution of the Amphora Barbera would probably have been a lot higher in alcohol, except for the sugar got converted into volatile acidity. So about 1 point of volatile acidity would have been 1 point of alcohol. So it would have been by 16.1, 16.2 had the yeast been able to finish it, but they didn't. Then on the other side, the Sangiovese conventional, quite a bit lower alcohol, and than the Amphora. So this wasn't supposed to have worked at all. Let's point that out. In any way, shape, or form, both of these wines were well under nutrients, and they shouldn't have finished ferment. In the Barbera, the Amphora was only similar because the ML bacteria had converted it to converted the sugar into volatile acidity. But we must have watered the conventional back a little bit. It's not in the records, though. I don't know whether we did or not. Maybe we just washed the bin quite a bit while we were fermenting it. Be happy to hear from you guys when you decide to type in the comment section. And then Sangiovese, did we water it back? I don't think so. I don't remember it. I don't remember the sugar being high enough. I thought we picked it and it was kind of low sugar. I thought it was like 23, but the report says 26. So I'm getting some conflicting data here. So anyway, very different conversions. That really low yan. The only thing I can figure on my only thought is that we did have maybe some lower sugar in the Amphora situation, is because the yan was so low. Whenever yeast are forced to convert in difficult environments, they make higher alcohol content. So the more stressed yeast are, the higher alcohol they'll make. So either we just had some blowout at the top of the open top fermenter, and then everything got kept in the Amphora, and then we had increased yeast stress, and they made a higher alcohol content. I don't know. It's not really clear. So just a little bit of a head scratcher, but maybe that's what the Amphora are all about. Let's go ahead and look at the titratable acidity for the Barbera conventional and the Amphora. We'll compare and contrast those two first. And we have a little bit higher in the conventional than in the Amphora, which surprises me because the volatile acidity in that is contributing to quite a bit of that acidity. So my guess is that maybe there was quite a bit of potassium in the skins or something like that. And then when we go to that help reduce that acidity, and that would also be true here if we compare and contrast the Sangiovese conventional versus the Amphora, and just the longer time that the skins are involved, there's just so much more potassium that's always around. We see an acid reduction, so a fairly low acidity in the Amphora Barbera. And let's go ahead and look at about that. So I'm not surprised by the Sangiovese. That makes complete sense. I would have thought the TA would be higher in the Amphora because of that VA. I'm just guessing skins and potassium. A little bit of a head scratcher, but we did see that in 2017 where our Amphora wines had lower titratable acidities. And here's the VA graph. That's pretty fun and really similar for the conventional fermentations. But the Amphora, holy guacamole, Barbera. And that's just a stuck ferment. And this is a really good example of what happens when you have a stuck ferment and active mallow. You get that increase in volatile acidity, but still, fortunately, legal. So just remember, if you're trying to prevent volatile acidity, remember to check your glucose fructose. And again, if I ever hear I measured dryness with a hydrometer, that doesn't work. That's like doing brain surgery with a pipe wrench. It's a very crude tool. You've got to have some sort of confirmation of dryness, whether that's through Reveline or enzymatic or some other method of getting confirmation that you have low residual sugar. The Kinetics tablets were fabulous when those are around. Those are for checking residual sugar in urine for people, but also that are diabetic. But it works really well for wineries too in small sense. So something you always got to check for dryness. In this case, we knew we had a problem, but we knew we were making a natural wine, and we knew we couldn't do anything about it. So we just had to monitor it, watch it, and we stirred it really, really regularly to try and keep some of the yeast moving along that may have been around to keep that volatile acidity from getting too high. And so we kept our fingers crossed and eventually got through it. But, it's definitely up there a little bit. But does it add to the sensory? Maybe. I think it's really interesting. All right. Then we take a look at the pH. And this is also sort of, what we typically see as well. That the conventionals tend to have lower pHs. And the reason for that, I think, is just that potassium in skins. And then when we get to the amphora, we have a little higher pHs. And I think, again, that potassium that's going to take that acidity out, it's going to raise the pH a little bit. But it's also going to be interesting when we look at the potassium. I think you'll be kind of intrigued as to how these look different in a potassium sense. But we definitely see a little bit higher pH in the amphora, and I think that's just due to the deacidification from potassium. So the only real surprise here is just how low the conventional Barbera is. We got that through 4 grams of malic. We see a really low pH on that. I mean, it came at 3.26, but to go through 4 grams of malic and only rise to pH 3.3 something. So really remarkable. So really impressive. The other side is we see in the amphora those really long skin contact times. There's a consequence to having acid go away, but that could be an advantage if you're in a really high acid region where you've got to get your acidities down, and maybe you don't have ideal conditions to build a whole lot of tannin. You could do a longer maceration because there is a difference in tannin. We'll look at those in a second. And then potassium. Notice the potassiums are all pretty similar with the exception of the conventional and on the Sangiovese. And the reason for that is because it's lower alcohol. Remember, these are all 15%, suddenly we go down to 14%. Well, when you still have tartaric acid in play, there's a certain solubility that you can hold in wine. And again, that idea of holding around 700 to 1,000 milligrams a liter of tannin, of potassium, is pretty normal. But we take a look at this guy here and notice we're carrying a lot more in the conventional. The reason for that is that the higher the alcohol gets, the less soluble potassium bitartrate is. So the higher the alcohol gets, the less soluble potassium bitartrate is. This is really important in sparkling wine because you're going to be adding sugar, you're going to be creating a fermentation, and then the alcohol content is going to go up in your sparkling wine. And therefore, your chance of throwing tartrates is pretty high. And that becomes problematic in sparkling wine because if you have a bunch of tartrates in a bottle with bubbles and you open it, the wine will come rushing out. In this case, just a lesson in that. But notice that the lower alcohol wine can carry considerably more potassium in it than the higher alcohol wine. So just that idea, potassium takeaway, that becomes less soluble as alcohol rises. The carrying capacity of 14% alcohol wine is much higher than a 15%. So we'd expect that, and that's just due to the alcohol content. Good learning lesson right there. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the tannins in these guys. All right, so we have, I think, an error here. I think it's an entry error on the side of ETS because we've seen this before, and I didn't catch it in time to call them to see if they could rerun the sample. So we're going to have to throw our hands up and say bummer. But in terms of the Barbera conventional, 357 milligrams a liter tannin versus 506 in the amphora, significantly more tannin. So one of the things I want to kind of talk about in terms of just looking at the Barbera, think about the Barbera in multiple different ways. We have in the amphora especially. So we have increased tannin, we have increased volatile acidity, and you just overall kind of what I would call mass, sensory mass of the wine is higher. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know the answer to that question, but we're going to see some other things as we go through that the amphora is going to just have a lot more stuff going on. And so I think there should be some real interesting complexities that we see in these wines. So again, I encourage you guys to kind of type in the comment section on YouTube video what you guys sense in this, because that'll be really fun to kind of have a back and forth in that section with your classmates. And I'd love to read that and love to hear your comments on it. Then the Sangiovese, I think the amphora probably has more tannin. I think we're just seeing a glitch in the screen. So I would reserve my judgment looking at the numbers on that. But it's better to report honestly than what we had on the report than to make up a number. So let's go ahead and talk about that. I think the Barbera is impressive. So the thing is that I want to think about, though, on the conventional Barbera is with a TA of 6.9 grams a liter. That's a lot of acid. Would you really want 500 milligrams a liter of tannin? Would that just be super gritty? So would it be better, or is it just really nice having this really pretty fruit wine? I don't know. That's an interesting concept. So roll with it, because you don't want to make that face. Okay, let's go ahead and look at catechin. Totally what we've seen every year past. And this is really fun because in literature, it says that after 10 days on skins, you won't get an increase in catechin. This has been written and published by a very famous phenolic chemist in Washington, and he says there's no such thing as seed extraction. There's no such thing as seed tannin. It's not real. It's fake, and blah blah. And he goes off ad nauseum. And we've done this over and over, and every year we see the same thing. When you leave things on skins for 100, 200, 300, 400 days, 300 days in this case, 2 to 300 days in this case, we see a major increase in catechin. We got a tripling in the Barbera and almost a doubling in Sangiovese. So definitely more seed phenolics, and it just makes sense. I mean, you've got seeds soaking in 15% alcohol solution for 300 days. Surprise, surprise. So takeaway, leave wine on skins for 300 plus days, and it goes up, really identical to the 17 trial. We saw very, very similar things in 2017. Here's an interesting one for you, and this is going to be a mind bender for you, because I'll bet you don't see this in your glass. What you see here compared to what you see in your glass are two very different things. I'll talk about why that is here in just a second. But notice that there's a lot more anthocyanins in the conventional, and there's a lot more in both treatments. There's a lot more in the Barbera. There's a lot more anthocyanins. And then in the conventional, there's, in both cases, the conventional has a lot more anthocyanins, because the reason for that is we're protecting them. Since we press off right away, anthocyanins are very soluble in water. They go right into solution. They're in there quick. And then after that, they're highly reactive. And we know that they are very labile and they go down quickly. And so this is one of those really things we talk about as an antioxidant. Anthocyanins are very much an antioxidant. And we're seeing that depletion because there's nothing else there acting as an antioxidant. However, what you're seeing in your glass probably is very different. So let's go ahead and talk about why the conventional has so much more, but it doesn't look that way. All right, so a quick lesson on this. Let's go to that pH notion. And so the conventional Barbera is probably much redder than the conventional Sangiovese because it's lower pH. And the other thing we want to talk about is not only that color difference, but there's another thing that's happening. And I'm betting in your glasses, both of the Amphora wines are going to look redder in spite of the fact that they have fewer anthocyanins. And there's a reason for that. This is really important, and it's because of this. Basically, that little glucose at the bottom is what refracts sunlight and lets you see it. And sulfur dioxide blocks your ability to see it. So in both of the Amphora wines, since there's no SO2, we see the anthocyanins completely. They aren't bleached. There's no bleaching effect. So awesome lesson, really cool stuff. I hope you see what I see. All right, let's talk about polymeric anthocyanins. We also saw this in the 17 trial. We have quite a few more, and this makes sense. The reason polymeric anthocyanins is because of oxygen. And we had a lot of anthocyanins in the Barbera to begin with. And then we carry that on, and then we apply quite a bit of oxygen, in that aging process. And there's a lot of polymerization that's happening. So we see an increase in both the Amphora treatments in polymeric anthocyanins. Pretty cool. So that means it's going to change the mouthfeel quite a bit. So in both cases, especially the Amphora Barbera, that wine's going to be much, much more polymerized, much, much more plush. So I imagine you're going to see a very stark difference in the way that you perceive both of these wines, especially because the Amphora Barbera has high tannin, but it also has a lot of polymeric anthocyanins. So you've got a pretty smooth wine, you've got more mass, you've got more everything. So it should really have a very different sensory perception. And so it should be pretty cool. So I also want to talk about one other thing in the idea of polymeric anthocyanins. So stuck fermentations are usually associated with excess acetaldehyde. So if you take a look at the little graph over here on the right, little graphic on the right, notice the first thing that basically what happens is glucose goes through glycolysis, all these different steps where it gets converted into pyruvate. And then that makes a little bit of carbon dioxide. And then in order to make acetaldehyde and ethanol, there's one more energy step that has to happen to create energy and keep things moving. And this is where the breakdown happens, is this conversion from acetaldehyde to ethanol. So not only do we have oxygen driving the train in the Barbera, we probably had a stuck ferment. So we had a lot of tannin glue being made by the yeast. So a combination of two things are driving massive polymeric anthocyanin building and making that quote-unquote tannin glue happen. And this creates the situation that not only are we getting some of those seed tannins that were probably migrating, and those were probably getting to build tannin. So we ended up with more tannin than we started with in the fruit, which is really, really cool. Pretty fascinating tool. So who knew that a stuck fermentation not only can increase your complexity from VA, but you're also going to create some excess acetaldehyde and create a more polymerized wine. So really a lot of complexities happening in that wine. Whether it's good or bad, I don't know, but I think there's going to be a lot of textural elements that come with this that are all very, very real, and the science behind them are there, and I think it's just super neat. And again, looking at that polymeric anthocyanin tannin index, the conventional Barbera is pretty smooth, but with high acid, probably got a little bit of grip to it, whereas the Amphora Barbera is really smooth, moderately high acid, and then a lot of complexity. Going to be really interesting to see how those compare. And then the Sangioveses aren't hugely different, but they're different enough that you might be able to perceive a little bit. But I think the really interesting lesson is going to be, just the regular anthocyanins. So the Amphora Takeaway as a whole, super cool study. Long-term extended maceration changes the phenolic profile and chemistry. And shooting for high alcohol wines is really risky with no nutrient additions. It shouldn't have worked in the Sangiovese. It shouldn't. 20 milligrams of yan, 21 milligrams of yan, and suddenly we're getting through to a 15% alcohol ferment with no stuck. That's absolutely amazing to me. And there's no reduction in that wine. It's totally not reduced. Fascinatingly cool. It just defies so many of the norms that we read in literature. So we have two norms that we've kind of shattered in both of these wines. Is that especially the Sangio, that you could ferment dry with 21 yan and no reduction, which is crazy. And I think it's just that long-term fermentation that happens. And then the other thing that's really cool that we violate is the idea that seed tannin extraction doesn't happen in extended maceration. And in extreme extended maceration, we definitely, year in and year out, have seen this. I think we have enough data now to show that absolutely there's such thing as seed extraction. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. You consider the outcome. But my theory is there's more research needed. We're going to have to keep doing these. And super fascinating. Definitely changed a lot of things I've learned in wine. And learned about winemaking. It shattered a lot of things that I accepted as truth, and it's just made me kind of wonder, why we do some of the things we do today. And I think, from a philosophical standpoint, much of wine science is bred out of the notion of industrial farming. So, and basically, most of the wine science that's done is for people that are producing industrial wine. And so they're farming on a massive scale and they're producing wine on a massive scale, and they need everything to work. They have to be very risk averse. And the only way I can really make an analogy to this is like with cattle. So if you're raising, 10,000 head of cattle on, say 5 acres, your input output model is very different than raising 10 cattle on 10 acres, where they're going to free range. They're going to just eat what vegetation's out there. And you probably don't need the antibiotics and all the other things because they're so spread out. You don't have those disease models that are going to show up in high input output farming. So the models for feeding and raising cattle in densely farmed areas and high industrial farming is very, very different than what we would experience, where we can kind of hand pet the cattle, make sure they're doing okay. And that's really the equivalent of the Amphora, is that this is 2 tiny ferments. There isn't a huge financial risk to us if it goes off the rails. And we can just sit there and take care of them. And we're going to be able to be a lot more hands-on. The amount of analysis that went into these wines, I mean, we're looking at almost $10,000 a wine in analysis when you start looking at all the glucose, fructose, and things we ran with ETS. So from a financial input standpoint, not very smart, but neither is raising 10 head of cattle on 10 acres compared to the profitability of raising, 10,000 head of cattle on 10 acres. So very different input output models, very different efficiencies. But we're not making a $5 bottle of wine. These are $30, $40 bottles of wine. So very different approach. And then because we can talk about it in a very real way, it's very valuable for our consumers. So, and people are willing to pay a lot more for a really expensive hand-petted organic beef. They'll pay 2 or 3 times as much, maybe 4 times as much than for the industrial farm stuff. And so we're kind of in that same model. So think of it that way. And I think it's a really cool study. I think we've learned a lot. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope you do too. And I hope it opens some eyeballs to different ways of approaching things. And it's super cool. Cheers.